The morning light slipped through the tall windows of the city courthouse, touching the old wooden benches and quiet hallways. People moved in and out, some with files in their hands, others whispering nervously about their cases. It was another busy day, one filled with small tensions and quiet hopes. A uniformed officer stood near the courtroom door, his eyes sharp and posture firm. He had worked here for years, seen every kind of person pass through those doors. To him, it was just another long day of keeping order, making sure no one caused trouble. He didn't smile much. Most people who walked into this place were already angry or scared, and he'd learned that kindness didn't always work here. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with low voices. Lawyers flipped through papers, the judge's clerk arranged documents, and a few people waited quietly for their cases to be called. The officer watched it all with a sense of control. He liked being in charge of the room, liked that people respected the badge on his chest. A few minutes before the hearing began, a woman walked in. She looked calm and confident, dressed in a simple but professional suit. She didn't carry any files or sit near the lawyers. She simply took a seat in the back row, watching everything around her with quiet focus. Her expression was thoughtful, almost curious, like someone observing rather than participating. The officer noticed her. Something about the way she carried herself stood out, but he didn't think much of it. To him, she was probably another family member waiting for a case to start, or maybe a social worker. He turned his attention back to the front as the judge entered the room. The first case began, a simple matter between a young man and his landlord. But tension built quickly. The defendant, a man in his 30s, kept interrupting the judge, raising his voice about unfair treatment and lost wages. His lawyer tried to calm him down, but the man wouldn't stop. The officer stepped closer, ready to intervene if needed. He'd seen small arguments turn into shouting matches before, and his instinct was always to stay alert. The judge warned the man to stay quiet, but he slammed his hand on the table. That was enough for the officer. He moved fast, grabbing the man by the arm to pull him back into his seat. The room froze. Everyone watched as the officer tried to calm the situation. The man resisted for a moment, but eventually sat down, still breathing heavily. The officer took a step back, his jaw tight. He didn't like being challenged, especially not in public. As he turned to return to his post, he noticed movement in the back of the room. The woman who had been sitting quietly had stood up, perhaps startled by the sudden noise. But to the officer, it looked like she was moving toward the front. Without thinking, he reacted. "Ma'am, stay back," he said sharply, holding up a hand. She stopped, surprised. But in that instant, another person nearby tripped slightly, bumping into her. The officer thought she was refusing to listen and moved quickly toward her. He grabbed her arm, not roughly at first, but firmly enough to stop her from moving closer to the front. "Ma'am, you can't interfere with court proceedings," he said, his voice stern. The woman looked directly at him. Her eyes were calm but strong. "I wasn't interfering," she said softly. "Then take your seat," he replied, still holding her arm. The room had gone completely silent. Even the judge was watching now. The woman didn't pull away or argue. She simply said, still steady, "Officer, please let go of me." Something about her tone, controlled but commanding, made him hesitate. He released her arm, stepping back. She didn't shout, didn't demand anything. She only looked at him for a moment, then turned and walked out of the courtroom quietly. The officer felt a strange unease. Usually when he had to stop someone, they argued or apologized. But this woman didn't do either. It was as if she didn't need to defend herself. That quiet confidence stayed in his mind even as the hearing continued. After the court session ended, whispers started around the room. A few people were talking about the woman who had left. One of the clerks mentioned seeing her earlier, speaking with someone from the mayor's office. The officer overheard and frowned. He didn't know why, but the comment made him nervous. He tried to brush it off. People came and went all the time. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about the whole moment had been off. As he stepped outside the courtroom, another officer came running down the hall. "Hey, they're here," the man said, out of breath. "Who's here?"
"The city officials."
"They're about to make an announcement in the main courtroom. The new police chief's coming today." "You didn't hear?" The officer blinked. "Today?" "Yeah. They're introducing her in front of the judges and staff. Big deal, apparently. Some diversity and reform thing." He shrugged, not too interested. Another leader trying to fix what can't be fixed, he muttered under his breath. Still, duty was duty. He followed his colleague down the hallway to the larger courtroom where the announcement was about to begin. When they entered, the room was already full. Lawyers, judges, clerks, and several senior officers were gathered near the front. A city official stood at the podium, thanking everyone for coming and talking about a new era of accountability and respect within the department. The officers stood at the back, arms crossed, trying to look attentive. He'd seen these speeches before, big words, little change. But then the official smiled and said, "It's my honor to introduce our new chief of police. Please welcome her." The doors at the side of the courtroom opened, and the woman from earlier, the one he had grabbed, walked in. Every muscle in his body froze. For a moment he thought he was seeing things, but no, it was her. The same woman, calm, confident, eyes steady. She walked up to the front as people began clapping. Some looked confused, others surprised, but the applause grew louder. The officer felt the air leave his lungs. His mind raced back to that moment in the courtroom, the way he had spoken to her, the way he had grabbed her arm. He stood perfectly still, his face flushing. She didn't look at him directly, but she must have recognized him. How could she not? The city official finished the introduction, and the new chief stepped up to the microphone. Her voice carried easily through the room, smooth and steady. "Thank you for the warm welcome," she began. "I know this department has seen many changes over the years. Some have been difficult. But I believe real change begins not in policies or paperwork, but in how we treat one another, especially when no one is watching." The officer felt his stomach twist. Her words weren't harsh, but they landed with weight. "In my career," she continued, "I've learned that respect can't be demanded. It has to be shown. Every person we meet deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter the situation." He knew then that she was speaking from that earlier moment. She didn't need to mention it. Everyone who had been in that courtroom earlier knew exactly what she meant. The crowd listened quietly, many nodding in agreement. The officer shifted slightly, wanting to disappear. He didn't dare meet her eyes. When the speech ended, people gathered around her to shake hands and offer congratulations. She smiled warmly, speaking with everyone politely. Even in the crowd, her calm energy stood out. She seemed to carry authority without needing to raise her voice. The officer slipped out quietly, his heart heavy. He walked down the long hallway toward the exit, feeling smaller than he ever had in his uniform. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful behind the badge. He felt exposed. He reached the locker room and sat down on the bench. The noise of conversation echoed faintly from down the hall. He ran a hand over his face, trying to process what had just happened. He had always seen himself as a man who kept order, someone who didn't take nonsense from anyone. But now, all he could think about was how fast he had judged her, how quickly he had assumed she was just another person getting in the way. He didn't mean to hurt anyone, but intent didn't matter now. The truth was he hadn't seen her as an equal. He hadn't even given her a chance. Outside, the sound of people talking and laughing carried down the hall. The new chief was meeting with senior staff now, setting the tone for her leadership. He sat there staring at the floor, knowing his actions had already made an impression, but not the kind he wanted. A small part of him hoped she would forget his face. But deep down he knew she wouldn't. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she didn't seem like the kind of person who forgot lessons. And this, he realized, was going to be a lesson for him. When he finally left the courthouse that day, the city air felt heavy. Cars passed by, horns sounded, people hurried across the streets. Life outside moved on as if nothing had happened. But for him, something had shifted. He walked toward his patrol car slowly, the badge on his chest catching the sunlight. For years, that badge had been his armor. Now it felt like a mirror, reflecting back everything he didn't want to see. As he sat behind the wheel, his hands rested on the steering wheel, unmoving. The courthouse loomed behind him, the memory of that woman's calm face still clear in his mind. He started the engine but didn't drive right away. He took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "You messed up." It wasn't anger he felt, it was something deeper, a mix of shame and realization. Because sometimes the moments that expose who we really are don't happen in front of cameras or crowds. They happen in the small, unexpected seconds when we think no one important is watching. but sometimes someone is. And that someone might just be the person who changes everything. The next morning, the courthouse felt different. People were still talking about the new chief of police and her unexpected introduction. The story had spread quickly through the hallways and offices, whispered between staff and officers. Most of them had no idea that the calm, well-dressed woman sitting in the courtroom the previous day was the person who would soon be leading them. For the officer, that day had not ended easily. He hadn't slept much the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, calm, steady, not angry but disappointed. He kept replaying that moment in his head, the second he had grabbed her arm without knowing who she was. He tried to tell himself it was just a misunderstanding, that he was only doing his job, but deep down he knew it wasn't that simple. When he reached the station that morning, the air inside felt heavy. People were gathered near the bulletin board, looking at a notice that had been pinned up. He didn't need to get closer to know what it was about. Her name was printed at the top, the announcement of her official appointment as chief of police. Some of the younger officers were excited. They talked about her impressive record, about how she had worked in several departments before and had a reputation for cleaning up broken systems. Others were more cautious. They'd seen new chiefs come and go, making promises that rarely changed anything. The officer stayed quiet. He didn't join the conversation, didn't give an opinion. He walked to his locker, changed into his uniform, and headed out for duty. But no matter how hard he tried to focus, the memory followed him everywhere. Later that afternoon, an email went out to all staff. It said the new chief wanted to meet with every officer in small groups over the next few weeks to hear their thoughts and understand their challenges. It sounded simple enough, but it made him uneasy. He knew sooner or later he'd be sitting across from her again. That evening, the chief walked through the station for the first time. The atmosphere shifted as soon as she entered. She didn't arrive with a big security team or an air of authority. She moved quietly, greeting people with a polite smile and shaking hands with anyone who approached her. She didn't act like someone who needed to prove her power. She already carried it naturally. When she entered the main hall, several officers stood a little straighter. Some whispered to each other. She stopped at each desk, asked simple questions, and thanked them for their work. When she reached the officer who had grabbed her, he felt his chest tighten. She looked at him for a brief second. Her face was calm, unreadable. "Good afternoon, officer," she said softly. He swallowed hard. "Good afternoon, Chief. Long day?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." She nodded once, holding his gaze for a moment longer before moving on. She didn't mention what had happened in the courtroom. She didn't need to. That brief exchange said enough. For the next few days, everyone could feel the quiet pressure that came with her leadership. There were no dramatic speeches, no sudden changes, just a sense that she was watching and listening closely. She attended court hearings, spoke with community members, and reviewed department files late into the night. She was calm, methodical, but there was no doubt she was in control. Then came the moment the officer had been dreading. His group meeting with the chief. It was held in a small conference room at the station. The chairs were arranged in a circle, and the chief sat among them, not at the head of the table, but with everyone else. It was an unexpected gesture that made people a little nervous. She smiled lightly and began to speak. "I wanted these meetings to be honest," she said, "not about rank or status. Just people talking about what works and what doesn't." She asked each person what they thought the department could improve. Some spoke about outdated equipment, others about long shifts. When it was his turn, he hesitated. She looked at him patiently, waiting. He cleared his throat. "Sometimes it feels like we're blamed for everything," he said carefully. "We try to do the right thing, but people only see our mistakes." She nodded slowly. "I understand that," she replied. "But the way we respond to mistakes, that's what defines us." Her words were simple, but they struck deep. He felt as if she were speaking directly to him. And maybe she was. When the meeting ended, she thanked everyone for their honesty. As people began to leave, she stopped him. "Officer," she said quietly, "could you stay a moment?" He froze. "Yes, Chief." The door closed softly behind the others. The room was suddenly too quiet. She looked at him, not coldly, not with anger, but with the kind of calm that made his stomach twist. "I know what happened in the courtroom," she said. "I know it wasn't out of hate, but it was careless." He nodded, shame rising in his chest. I didn't realize that I was the new chief? She finished gently. I understand that. But that's not the point. He looked down. You're right. She leaned back slightly in her chair. I wasn't angry, but I was reminded of how quickly people make assumptions. It happens to many of us in and out of uniform. He didn't know what to say. The words stuck in his throat. I want you to think about something, she continued. If I had been an ordinary woman that day, not the chief, would your behavior have been the same? He hesitated, then whispered, maybe not. She gave a small, sad smile. That's what I thought. For a long moment, they sat in silence. He wanted to apologize, but it felt too easy, too small compared to what she was saying. I'm not here to embarrass you, she said finally, but I do expect you to learn from this, because what happened in that courtroom is exactly why I took this job. Her voice softened, but her words stayed sharp. People deserve to feel safe around us, not scared of us. We wear the badge, but we're still human, and we need to remember that every single day. He nodded slowly. Yes, Chief. She studied him for a moment. You've been in this job for a while, haven't you? 13 years. Then you know how easy it is to stop seeing people as people. He let out a quiet breath. Sometimes, yes. I want you to be part of this change, she said. Not against it. Her tone wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. He nodded again. I understand. When he left the room, his chest felt heavy, but in a different way. Not from fear this time, from realization. He had never had a superior speak to him like that before. Not with anger, but with truth. It stayed with him the rest of the day. Over the next few weeks, changes began to ripple through the department. Small ones at first. New community programs, regular discussions about mental health, and stricter reviews of officer conduct. Some people complained that she was being too strict, too idealistic, but others quietly admired her. She didn't lecture. She listened. And somehow that made everyone want to do better. The officer noticed it too. Slowly, the air in the station felt less tense. People started helping one another more. He even found himself thinking differently during his shifts, catching himself before reacting too quickly, trying to speak calmly where he might once have raised his voice. One afternoon, he was assigned to courthouse security again, the same place where everything had started. As he walked through the familiar halls, he felt the weight of memory pressing down. He stood at his post quietly, observing the people around him. At one point, a young woman walked in, nervous and lost. She asked where she was supposed to go, her hands trembling as she held her paperwork. Normally, he would have pointed and told her to hurry along, but instead he took a moment to guide her. It's okay, he said gently. You're in the right place. Just wait in that line over there. She smiled, relief showing on her face. Thank you, it was a small thing. But it felt different this time, like something inside him had shifted, even if just a little. When he got off duty that evening, he saw the chief leaving her office. She noticed him and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. He nodded back. There were no words, but none were needed. He didn't know what the future would hold or how much he could change after so many years of doing things one way. But for the first time, he wanted to try. That night, he drove home through quiet streets. The city lights reflected in the windows, and for once he didn't feel angry at the world. He felt humbled, because now he understood that respect wasn't just something people owed him because of his badge. It was something he had to earn every day, by how he treated others. And as he parked his car and looked at the night sky, he thought about the chief's words. Change doesn't happen all at once. It begins the moment you realize you were wrong. That thought stayed with him long after the night turned silent. Days turned into weeks, and the new chief's influence spread quietly through the department. She didn't rule with fear or big speeches. Instead, she worked from the inside out, listening, observing, and making small but powerful changes. Everyone could feel that things were shifting, even if they couldn't yet describe how. Some officers felt proud to have her leading them. Others weren't sure what to think. But one thing was clear, she was serious about change. She wasn't just filling a position. She was rebuilding trust that had been lost long before she arrived. The officer who had grabbed her that day kept his head down. He did his job quietly, spoke less, and listened more. He noticed things now, how people reacted to his tone, how his words could calm or worsen a situation. He wasn't the same as before, though he didn't talk about it. Something in him had begun to shift slowly but surely. Then one morning, An internal memo spread through the department. It said that the chief had ordered a review of all past complaints of misconduct within the force. Every file, every case that had been closed without proper follow-up would be looked at again. The announcement sent a wave of tension through the building. Officers whispered in hallways, wondering if their names would appear on those lists. Some tried to act calm, but everyone knew this review could change everything. The officer sat at his desk reading the notice twice. His stomach felt tight. He had been in the department for over a decade. He knew he hadn't been perfect. He'd had a few complaints filed against him. Angry citizens saying he'd been rude or too rough during arrests. None of them had ever gone anywhere. They were just part of the job, he used to tell himself. But now those old records might come back. For the next few days, the station was full of quiet anxiety. Files were being pulled, reports re-examined, and interviews scheduled. The chief was firm but fair. She wanted transparency, not punishment. But people still feared what might surface. Late one afternoon, he was called into the Internal Affairs office. His heart sank. He knew what this was about. A young investigator greeted him politely. "Officer, we're reviewing a few of your past reports," she said. "It's just routine. We'd like to go over them with you." He nodded, trying to stay composed. She placed a few folders on the table. He recognized them immediately. Complaints from years ago. Incidents he had long forgotten or maybe tried to forget. A man claiming he'd been shoved unnecessarily. A woman saying she'd been spoken to disrespectfully during a traffic stop. Nothing extreme, but reading them now felt different. The investigator wasn't harsh. She simply asked questions: what had happened, what he remembered, how he handled those moments. He answered honestly. He didn't try to defend himself too much this time. The more he spoke, the more he realized how his behavior had been shaped by years of frustration and pride. When the meeting ended, the investigator said, "Thank you for being honest. These reviews aren't about blame. They're about learning." He nodded quietly and left the room. Outside, the chief was walking down the hall. She saw him and stopped. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yes, Chief," he said, then paused. "Just a lot to think about." She smiled slightly. That's how change starts. Her tone wasn't judgmental. It was calm, steady, as if she truly wanted everyone, including him, to grow from this process. Over the next few weeks, the review uncovered more than anyone expected. It wasn't just about bad behavior. It revealed years of neglect, cases ignored, citizens dismissed, small acts of disrespect that had built up into a wall between the police and the community. The chief faced it all with quiet determination. She held meetings with community leaders asking for their input. She met families who had filed complaints in the past and never received an answer. Some people were angry. Others were simply tired. She listened to them all. One evening, after a long day of reviewing files, the chief sat alone in her office, staring at the stack of papers on her desk. The stories inside those folders weren't just about bad policing. They were about pain, misunderstanding, and the slow loss of trust. She knew fixing that wouldn't be easy. Outside her office, the officer walked past and saw the light still on. He hesitated, then knocked softly on the door. "Come in," she said without looking up. He stepped inside. "You're still here, Chief?" She gave a small smile. "I could ask you the same." He nodded awkwardly, unsure what to say next. After a pause, she gestured to the chair across from her. "Have a seat." He sat down, feeling the same quiet weight he always did in her presence. She looked at him thoughtfully. "How are you handling all this?" "It's hard," he admitted. "Looking back at those old reports, seeing things I didn't take seriously before, it's not easy." "It's not supposed to be," she said gently. "But it's necessary." He nodded, staring at the floor. "I used to think people were just making a fuss, that they didn't understand what we deal with. But now I realize I didn't understand them either." She folded her hands. "Most people don't want to hate the police. They just want to be treated with respect." He looked up. "I guess I forgot that." "Then remember it now," she said softly. "It's never too late to start over." Her words stayed with him. That night, he couldn't stop thinking about the faces of the people he had once brushed off. The man he'd spoken to harshly. The woman he'd rushed during a stop. The strangers who had looked at him with fear instead of trust. He wondered how many small moments like that had built up over time. How many could have been avoided if he had just slowed down, listened, and cared a little more. The next morning, he arrived early for his shift. The station was still quiet, and for once he liked it that way. He spent the first hour organizing old files, making sure his reports were clear and accurate. It wasn't required, but it felt right. Later that week, the chief called a meeting with several officers to discuss the results of the internal review. She stood at the front of the room, calm but serious. "I know this process hasn't been easy," she said, "but I'm proud of those who face their mistakes honestly. This isn't about punishment, it's about rebuilding what's been broken." She looked around the room, her eyes meeting each person's for a brief moment. "We can't change the past, but we can control what we do next. The people out there, they need to see us differently. They need to know we care. That starts with how we treat them and how we treat each other." There was silence after she finished, not because people disagreed, but because they felt the truth of what she said. After the meeting, he caught up to her in the hallway. "Chief," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you for how you handled everything." She smiled. "You handled it too. That's what matters." He hesitated, then added, "I'm trying to do better." "I can see that," she said. "Keep going." Her encouragement gave him a small sense of relief. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. It was trust, and that felt even more meaningful. As weeks passed, the department began to change in small but visible ways. Officers greeted citizens more politely. Complaints dropped. Community meetings were held regularly, and the chief attended every single one. People who once refused to speak with police now began to show up, curious to see if the change was real. The officer often volunteered for those events. At first, people looked at him with suspicion, remembering his old reputation. But over time, they noticed the difference in his tone, in his patience. He wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And sometimes trying is the first real step. One evening, during a community meeting, an older man stood up and said, "For years, we felt like no one listened. But now it feels different. Thank you." The chief nodded humbly, but she glanced toward the officer who stood at the side of the room quietly listening. He didn't say anything, but the look on his face said enough. That night, as he walked to his car, he felt lighter than he had in a long time. The city lights flickered across the wet streets, and for the first time, he believed things could truly get better, not just for the department, but for everyone they served. Change was still fragile, still new, but it was real. And it was happening right in front of him. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for sure: he would never again forget the lesson that started it all, because one small act in that courtroom had opened a door he never knew needed. Opening and walking through it had changed him forever. Days turned into weeks, and the officer's suspension stretched longer than he expected. At first he was angry. Angry at the system, angry at the new chief, angry at himself for losing control in the courtroom that day. But as time went on, the anger began to fade and was replaced by something he wasn't used to feeling: quiet shame. He had spent years believing he was doing his duty right, that every firm command and every harsh tone was justified, because the job was tough. He used to tell himself that being soft meant being weak, but now, sitting alone at home with nothing but time to think, he started seeing things differently. He remembered the faces of people he had arrested, some scared, some angry, some just tired. He could see now that not every person he yelled at was guilty of something bad. Some were just caught in the wrong place or scared of him. That thought made him uneasy. He had been proud of his reputation for being tough. But what if being tough had only made people fear him, not respect him? One morning, he got a call from the department asking him to come in. His stomach tightened. He thought it might be bad news. Maybe they had decided to let him go for good. But when he arrived, he was told that the chief wanted to see him personally. He hesitated outside her office door for a long moment before knocking. When he entered, she was sitting behind her desk reading a report. She looked up, calm and steady as always, and motioned for him to sit down. For a few seconds, there was silence. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Then she spoke softly. "I know you've had some time to think." He nodded, not trusting his voice. She continued, "I could have ended your career that day in court. A lot of people told me I should. But I don't believe in destroying someone when there's a chance to rebuild them." He looked at her, surprised. He didn't expect kindness from her, not after what he did. Why? He asked quietly. She leaned back slightly. Because I've been where you are, she said. Not in the same way, but I've been underestimated, disrespected, treated unfairly. It changes you, but it can change you for better or for worse. That's up to you. Her words hung in the air. He felt something stir inside him. Not defensiveness, not guilt exactly, but a kind of understanding he hadn't allowed himself before. I don't expect you to be perfect, she said, but I expect you to be honest with yourself. You can't treat people with respect if you don't see them as people. You can't do this job right if you only see danger and not humanity. He lowered his eyes. For years, that was exactly how he had operated, scanning for threats, keeping his guard up, never letting emotion in. But now those habits felt heavy, almost like armor that had trapped him inside. The chief went on. I'm giving you a chance. It's not an easy one. You'll have to attend every training, work with community groups, and report directly to me for the next few months. It's not punishment. It's a chance to rebuild what's been broken. He felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, but gratitude mixed with fear. He nodded slowly. I'll do it, he said quietly. She gave a small nod. Good, don't do it for me. Do it for yourself. You've got more in you than what happened in that courtroom. As he left her office, he felt lighter, though unsure of what lay ahead. Over the next weeks, he started his training sessions. The first few were uncomfortable. He sat in a small room with other officers and listened to instructors talk about communication, empathy, and the effects of bias. At first, he thought it was pointless, just words and theories. But then they brought in community members to speak. One man told the story of how he'd been stopped and searched on his way home from work, treated like a criminal in front of his children. The officer listened, remembering how many times he had done similar things without thinking twice. The man's voice shook as he spoke, but he didn't sound hateful. He just sounded tired. Another woman, a teacher, shared how her students grew up afraid of the police, even though they had done nothing wrong. They think you all see them as trouble before they even open their mouths, she said softly. The officer couldn't look her in the eyes. He realized that maybe he had been part of the reason for that fear. Every session left him thinking more deeply. He began writing down thoughts in a small notebook, something he hadn't done since his academy days. He wrote about what respect really meant, about how quickly judgment could replace understanding, and about how small actions could change the way someone saw the world. He also started spending time at community meetings. At first, people looked at him with suspicion. Some even avoided him completely. He didn't blame them, but he kept showing up, sitting quietly, listening, sometimes helping with small things like setting up chairs or serving coffee. Slowly, a few people began to nod at him, then greet him and eventually talk to him. One afternoon, he found himself sitting with an older man outside the community center. The man looked at him and said, You know, people don't hate the badge. They hate how some people wear it. That sentence stayed with him for days. By the time his next meeting with the chief came around, he felt different, not completely changed, but aware. When he entered her office, she noticed it right away. You've been quiet lately, she said. He nodded. I've been thinking, he replied. About things I used to ignore. She smiled faintly. That's where change starts. He hesitated, then said, I used to think this job was about control. Now I think it's more about patience, about seeing people before seeing their mistakes. The chief leaned forward, elbows on the desk. That's exactly it. Control without compassion turns into abuse, but compassion without control turns into chaos. The balance is what makes a good officer. Her words hit deep. He left her office that day not with guilt but with purpose. He began applying what he'd learned. When he returned to duty, he made sure to talk calmly even in stressful moments. He tried to listen before reacting. It wasn't easy. Old habits came back fast. But he caught himself before they took over. There was one incident where a young man got loud with him during a traffic stop. The old version of him would have shouted back immediately, but this time he took a breath and said, Let's just talk, all right? The young man looked confused at first, but the situation cooled down within minutes. Later, the man thanked him for not losing his temper. It was a small thing, but to him it meant everything. That night, when he got home, he thought about what the chief had said in her office and about rebuilding what's broken. He realized she hadn't just been talking about his career. She was talking about him as a person. He looked in the mirror and didn't see the same man anymore. The uniform still fit, but it meant something different now. It wasn't armor or authority. It was responsibility. Weeks turned into months. He completed his training, continued community outreach, and kept a clean record. The chief didn't praise him publicly, but she noticed his effort. She saw it in how he spoke to others, how he carried himself, and how his fellow officers started following his lead. One evening, she called him into her office again. He stood there expecting another round of advice, but she simply said, "I'm proud of the work you're doing. Keep going." He nodded, unable to find words. When he walked out, he saw younger officers in the hallway, some who used to mock community programs, now signing up for the next training session. Maybe they had noticed his change too, and that realization warmed something inside him. He went home that night, opened his notebook, and wrote, "Respect doesn't start with others. It starts with what you're willing to face in yourself." He closed the book and sat quietly for a long time, listening to the hum of the city outside. For the first time in years, he felt peace, not because everything was fixed, but because he was finally moving in the right direction. Months had passed since that day in court, the day that changed everything. The officer had rebuilt not only his place in the department, but also something deeper within himself. He had learned that respect wasn't earned by shouting louder or standing taller, but by understanding people and treating them with dignity. And though the road to change had been hard, it was one he walked willingly. The department itself had started to feel different. It wasn't overnight, but bit by bit things began to shift. The chief had introduced new training sessions that focused on communication and emotional awareness. Instead of long lectures, she organized open discussions where officers could talk about what they faced in the field, the fears, the pressure, the anger, and the moments that tested them. Some officers rolled their eyes at first. Change always made people uncomfortable, but the chief didn't push them. She just led by example. She attended the sessions herself, listened to stories, shared her own experiences, and slowly, people began to trust her vision. The officer often sat quietly in those sessions, listening. Sometimes he would speak up, sharing what he had learned the hard way and about patience, about pride, about how one mistake could change everything. And each time he spoke, the room would fall silent. He wasn't a perfect man, but he had something rare now: humility. One day, during a department meeting, the chief spoke about the importance of community trust. "People should not fear the ones meant to protect them," she said calmly. "We cannot lead through fear. We must lead through respect." As she spoke, the officer looked around the room and saw heads nodding. Months ago, that might not have happened. Now people were starting to understand. After the meeting, one of the younger officers came up to him. "I used to think all that empathy stuff was just talk," the young man said, half smiling. "But seeing how you've changed, it makes me think maybe I can do better too." The older officer didn't know what to say at first. He just nodded, a little surprised but quietly proud. Over the next few weeks, he kept himself busy with patrols and community visits. He was now part of a small outreach team that went to schools, youth centers, and neighborhood events. At first, he thought people might not welcome him, but to his surprise, they did. Kids asked questions, teenagers listened when he talked about choices, and even adults who once distrusted the police started opening up. He remembered one afternoon at a local park. A group of kids was playing basketball, and one of them accidentally hit him with the ball. The boy froze, expecting anger. But instead, the officer laughed and tossed the ball back. "Next time, aim for the hoop," he said. The kids laughed, and from then on, they invited him to join their games whenever he passed by. Moments like that made him realize how small acts could rebuild bridges that had been broken for years. Meanwhile, the chief continued her quiet mission. She didn't seek praise or attention. She spent her days visiting precincts, attending meetings, and checking in on her officers. People began to respect her not because of her title, but because she listened, really listened. One morning, the chief announced a new initiative, a community partnership program where officers would be paired with local residents to work on improving neighborhood safety together. It was something unheard of before. Some officers were hesitant, unsure how it would go, but the chief believed it could change everything. The officer volunteered to be part of the first group. He was paired with a local teacher who had once spoken out against police behavior. Their first meeting was awkward, both unsure how to start. But as they talked, they found common ground. Both wanted safer streets. Both cared about the kids growing up in their community. Over time, they began working together, organizing safety workshops, and helping at-risk youth find better paths. The collaboration started to draw attention. Local news outlets began covering the program, highlighting the changes happening in the department. One day, the chief was invited to a press conference to talk about the initiative. The officer stood quietly at the back of the room, just there to support. Cameras flashed, microphones filled the air with questions. The chief spoke calmly and clearly, explaining that true change comes from within, from people being willing to see their mistakes and learn from them. Then, one reporter asked about the courtroom incident that had started it all. The room went silent for a moment. The chief smiled gently and said, "Sometimes life gives us lessons in ways we don't expect. What matters is what we do after the lesson." Her tone was firm but forgiving, and the audience listened intently. She didn't name the officer or mention details, but everyone knew who she meant. He stood there quietly, listening, his chest heavy with emotion. After the conference, as people started to leave, the chief turned and caught his eye. She gave him a small nod, a gesture of quiet respect. That one look meant more to him than any award or public praise ever could. In the following months, the changes continued to grow. Complaints against the department dropped. Officers began volunteering for training instead of being forced into it. Community events saw more cooperation than tension. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The officer kept his notebook, filling it with thoughts, reflections, and things he wanted to remember. He even began mentoring a few younger officers who struggled with temper or stress, sharing the advice that had helped him. "You can't fix what you refuse to face," he would tell them. One evening, after a long day, he found himself walking past the courthouse, the same one where everything had started months ago. He stopped for a moment, staring at the steps where he once made the mistake that changed his life. It felt strange. The place looked the same, but he didn't. He sat on one of the benches outside, thinking about how far he had come. For the first time, he didn't feel haunted by that memory. Instead, he felt grateful. Sometimes the hardest moments are the ones that wake you up. As he sat there, he saw a young officer walking by, one of the rookies from the new training program. The young man recognized him and smiled. "Hey, I've been hearing a lot about you," he said. "They say you're one of the good ones now," the older officer chuckled softly. "I'm just trying to do better each day," he said. "That's all any of us can do." The young man nodded and went on his way. The older officer watched him go, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. The next morning, he reported to work early as usual. He walked into the station and saw the chief talking with a few officers near the main desk. She turned as he entered and smiled. "Morning," she said simply. "Morning, Chief," he replied. They didn't need to say more. There was an understanding between them, built not on rank or rules, but on mutual respect. Later that day, the chief gathered everyone in the meeting hall. She stood at the front, her presence calm but powerful. "We're not just here to enforce the law," she said. "We're here to serve people, to protect them, to guide them, to remind them that trust still exists in this world. Every badge in this room means responsibility. Every voice matters." The room was silent as she spoke. Every officer listened, not out of fear, but because her words felt real. When she finished, she looked around and said softly, "Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because of all of us." As people began to leave, the officer stayed behind for a moment. He walked up to her and said quietly, "Thank you for not giving up on me." She looked at him, her eyes kind. "Thank you for proving me right," she replied. He smiled, nodded, and walked out into the sunlight. The world outside was noisy as always, cars honking, people rushing, life moving fast. But inside he felt calm. He knew there would always be challenges, mistakes, and people who didn't understand. But he also knew that change had to start somewhere, and he was proud it had started with him. As he got into his car and drove through the city streets, he noticed how familiar everything looked, yet it all felt different now. Maybe the world hadn't changed completely, but his eyes had, and that made all the difference. That night, before going to bed, he opened his notebook one last time and wrote, "Change is not about erasing the past. It's about learning from it and making tomorrow better than yesterday. He closed the notebook, set it on his nightstand, and turned off the light. The day had ended, but for him it didn't feel like an ending at all. It felt like a beginning.